As managers, one of the things we really dislike doing is giving constructive feedback to our team. It feels really uncomfortable. It's not something we enjoy doing. Probably at some point in your career, you've had some feedback that you found difficult to take, and that obviously makes you concerned about doing the same with one of your team members. So it's really important that we think carefully before we enter into having a difficult conversation with a member of staff. And there are a few areas that you may need to broach a conversation of this type. For example, if you're dealing with somebody who's performing below where you expect them to be, this is the most common reason that people have to have a difficult conversation. But it might also be that you've got conflict in the team and you need to talk to two different people about how their behaviour is impacting on the team. It might be that you've got some big changes coming up and you need to have a difficult conversation relating to redundancy, for example. Or one challenging one we see is where you have someone in the team who's got a personal hygiene problem, and that can also be a really difficult topic to tackle. So one of the things we're going to do today is take you through a framework for structuring your difficult conversations so that you can feel really prepared and that it goes to plan. Generally, these types of problems don't go away by themselves, so sticking your head in the sand is not an option. The purpose of today is to give you the confidence to be able to broach these topics and know what you want to get out of the conversation and be really clear and control that conversation with the team member. There are 5 main points that we're going to cover today that you're going to go through in this video that will help you. The first one is we're going to prepare. The second one is we're going to practice. The third one is we're going to really stick to the facts and be really clear about the messages that we want to get across. The fourth one is we're going to be really explicit about the improvement that we wish to see. And the fifth point is how to summarise and to commit to action, so get the employee to commit to taking action based on the feedback that you've given. So the first point is prepare. It is so important not to have this conversation off the cuff. It will almost certainly always go wrong. So preparing is absolutely critical. We need to take probably 20 minutes to half an hour to sit down and plan what you're going to say and the effect that you want to achieve. So if you've got less than that amount of time before having the meeting with the employee, postpone it. It's not worth trying to have these type of conversations without preparing. The first step in preparing is to start with the end in mind. What do you really want to get out of this conversation? What's the best outcome for you of having this conversation? Think about that and write it down. You know, what is the one thing that you want the employee to take away from the conversation? And really think about the points that you want to raise and how you want the employee to feel. So write that down just for a minute, pause the video, write down, what's the best outcome from this meeting. Some of the things you might have written down might be for the employee to improve their performance. It might be for the employee to make sure they're on time to work in future, or make sure that they check their work before they submit it to you. They're the kinds of things, that's the one thing that you really want this meeting to get across to them. The second point is to practice. It's really important to do a bit of practice before you start this meeting. And the one thing that I really recommend that you practice is how you actually open the conversation, because usually managers are the thing they're most worried about is actually starting the conversation. Once you get into the conversation, things will flow because you kind of know the points that you want to get across. So think about the practicalities of this meeting. Is it a planned meeting? Is it via video? Is it going to be by Teams? Because that will affect how you kind of open the meeting. So if it's a pre-planned meeting and it's in their diary, that's one tack. If actually you're going to tap them on the shoulder in the workplace and say, have you got a moment to come over and have a chat with me, then there's going to be a slightly different tack. So think about the practicalities. I usually recommend that it doesn't need to be a planned meeting, but if it's going to be face-to-face, obviously you do need to think about how you're actually going to start that conversation. So you might, if it is in an office environment where you've got others around you, you obviously want to be conscious of that. So you might go up to the person and say, have you got a moment? There's a few things that I'd like to chat through with you. And then you come into the meeting room. I don't recommend that you have a long preamble or that you start with positive feedback or any of those kind of models. I recommend that you get straight to the point. So you're going to be saying to that person, look, I've got a few concerns that I'd like to talk to you about today and get your feedback on them. Or you might say something about like, I've got a few things that I'd like to share with you that will help us work together better. Or, I've got some feedback that I've received that I'd like to share with you and talk through and get your view on it. So something quite open, something non-threatening, but you're getting straight to the point. You're not sort of trying to give some positive feedback and then give some negative feedback, which can come across as quite disingenuous. The second thing to practice is your key sentence. So this is probably the sentence that you wrote down earlier as what do you really want to get out of the meeting? What do you want that employee to walk away with? In these meetings, often the employee can feel a bit taken aback or a bit shocked, and a lot of what you say they won't remember. But the one thing that you do want them to remember, you want to repeat several times during the meeting. And that might be, some of the examples I gave earlier. For example, I just need you to check your work before you send it over to me. And you would want to say that probably 3 or 4 times during the meeting, so they really get that point across. I really need you to arrive on time for our team meetings. So practice that key sentence. What is the one thing that you want to get across that employee should remember? The third area that we're going to talk about is sticking to the facts. It's so important in these meetings that we are clear about the facts and we give really clear examples so that the employee knows exactly what you're talking about. Phrases like, you're always making mistakes, you're always late, they're not helpful. They sound like an opinion, you're not backing it up with evidence, and you're not talking about a specific incident or examples that the employee can delve into and explore with you. So I really recommend in your prep time, taking some time to write down 3 or 4 things that you can talk about that are specific examples of the behaviour or conduct that needs to change. So they might be things like, last Wednesday, you arrived late to the team meeting and then you continue to cut across Jack in the meeting. There's a fact. It might be in last month's report, you didn't use the format that I'd asked you to use the previous month. Last Monday, I noticed that you completely ignored Deborah and you didn't say hello to her when she said hello to you. So really specific things, examples that the employee will be able to remember, and that you can then talk about, what was your perspective on that occasion? Did you recognise that you didn't acknowledge Deborah when she said hello to you? You can have a conversation about the facts rather than going into kind of a defensive response around an opinion that you've expressed, you're always late. The other thing to prepare accompanying the fact is the impact of that behaviour. What did that mean to the other people or to you that resulted from that behaviour? So, for example, when you ignore a team member, it creates an atmosphere and it's uncomfortable for people. Or another example, when you arrive late to a team meeting, it disrupts the meeting and we have to repeat what we've been saying, which wastes everybody's time. So you're being really clear with the employee. It's not the reason why the conduct or the performance is a problem, what its impact is to the business. And again, this makes it harder in a way for the employee just to be very defensive about it. Sometimes it's also useful to refer to your company values when you're giving this sort of feedback. So you might say something like, one of our values is respect. And when you ignore a fellow team member, that doesn't really feel like it's in line with our values. So again, it can be another way of explaining to the employee the impact of their behaviour and making the sense that, that it's really important that they actually change this behaviour if they're going to continue to do well in your business. In this section 4, we're going to prepare what it is that we want them to do differently. So at this point in the conversation, you've told them what the concerns that you have, and you've told them about the impact of their conduct or poor performance on the business. And this point, it's about asking the right questions to understand what you both can do to change that and to get them to improve. So I would write down some questions in this section, and I'll give you some of those in a second, but also what things do you want them to do differently? So, in the examples we've given, it's, I would like to see you arriving on time, and what can they do to ensure that happens? Do they need to set an alarm earlier? Do they need to use a different method of getting to work? Do they need to share a lift with a friend? So you're starting to go into kind of action planning with the employee as to how they can make those improvements. So lots of nice open questions in this section. Things like, what action do you think you can take to make an improvement? What else do you think you could do differently? How could I help you to change that or improve how you're working? Is there any support that you need from me? So lots of kind of exploratory questions in this section. And again, write those questions down. The other thing I always say to people when we're having these difficult conversations is don't be afraid to use silence. It can be really tempting to kind of jump in, and if there is a bit of a silence or the employee isn't saying anything, to answer the question for them or to carry on talking. And what you really want to do in this meeting is provoke them to come up with the answer. And if you're constantly talking, that's very difficult for them to do. So if you need to, ask a question and then count to 10 and don't say anything. And it's going to feel really uncomfortable. So this is another thing that you need to practice. Asking the question, look away, give them time to think. If they're struggling, say to them, have you got any ideas about that? Or something open again, what do you think? And just give them time to think. And even though it feels really uncomfortable, it's the best way to get them talking. You do not want to be doing all the talking in this meeting. Okay, so the final section of your meeting is where you want to summarise and get the employee to commit to taking some action. This isn't something you really need to prepare, but you do want to make sure that you cover this in the meeting. So what you're really doing here is a technique of making sure that you fully understood any points that they've raised. So you might want to summarise what they've said at certain points in the meeting. Just pause and say, okay, let me just really understand that I've understood what you're saying, or let me just summarise where we are. And you might say something like, I understand that you've said you're really struggling to get in for 9, which is when our team meeting is. You've committed to setting your alarm a little bit earlier, which is great. But I've also said that I'm happy to move the team meeting to 9:15 to make sure that you've got time to get in. Is that right? Are you happy with that? How committed are you to setting your alarm earlier and making sure that happens, just so you really get their kind of commitment to action. You might also explore at this time when you've summarised to say, okay, we've said that you're going to check your work before you submit it to me. What can I do to support you with that? Is there anything else I can do to help make sure that happens? And then you can have a conversation about, is there a checklist needed? Do they need to have a check-in with you before they finally submit the work? What would make sure that happens? And then you can say to them again, how committed are you to making that happen? These are all good coaching questions, really. At this time, you're really just trying to elicit responses from them that make sure that the improvement is actually going to happen and they know the action they need to take. One thing you might want to have a look at is the GROW model. It's a great coaching model for line managers to use, in all sorts of conversations, but particularly in these difficult conversations. Pick out some of the questions from the GROW model, and there are some resources that you'll find accompanying this video, which will include some information on the GROW model. Last thing to do after the meeting is to send them a short summary of the meeting. I always find it's really helpful to put it in writing because, like I said to you earlier, an employee often will not remember most of what you've said in that meeting, and it's your opportunity to really repeat your key sentence again, but also to put right any areas that maybe you feel like you didn't quite cover enough in the meeting that you really want to be clear about. So you can use your notes, so you're not kind of starting from scratch, but I would recommend that you send an overview of the meeting, which includes things like the key sentence. That will mean that you're covering, the behaviour or the performance that needs to improve, the improvement that you do wish to see, what the employee has agreed to do, what you have agreed to do as the line manager to support the employee. When you'll next catch up and when you'll next review, it's really important to have, I think, a date in the diary if you can, or a timeline at which you'll come back together and say, how are things going? Has it improved? Are we seeing a different behaviour? The other thing you might want to put in there are the consequences of not improving. Sometimes this can feel a bit pointed, and there are sort of phrases you can use like, I do need to make you aware if you don't make the improvements, then we will have to start a formal process. So it doesn't sound too threatening. I never really like to use the word disciplinary because you are at a fairly early stage usually in these conversations, but you can put that in if that's something that you've said, or if you really do want to make it clear to the employee that that is the next step. There are some other resources that we've put together for you that you might find useful to help you with your planning. One of them is our video on giving and receiving feedback. Handling effective review meetings is another video that we've done for you. And we have various guides on handling difficult conversations, giving feedback, conducting reviews with employees. So hopefully you'll find that useful.